Hello, everyone, and welcome to New Wave History. I'm Hamza Hashim, and we're joined today by Dr. Usman Qasmi. He's the author of the recent book Qaum, Mulk, Sultanat, Citizenship and National Belonging in Pakistan. Welcome, sir. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, you've written previously widely about the question of citizenship and belonging in Pakistan. Your previous books include Ahmadis and the politics of religious exclusion in Pakistan. You've written about the idea of Pakistan itself with your edited volume on Muslims against the Muslim League and critiques on the idea of Pakistan. I want to start off by talking to you about what inspired this vein of scholarship in particular, and what served as the inspiration for this book.
So first of all, I think it goes back to like as you pointed out, my other work, especially the book on the Ahmadi issue, and since the book was looking at how the Ahmadi question, if you want to phrase it this way, it gets framed in Pakistan. Whereby a distinction, certain kind of a distinction is made between a believer citizen and a non-believer citizen, and a certain kind of an idea about what it means to be Islamic, what it means to be Muslim, is adopted by the state and implemented. So there is inherently a process whereby the state itself is creating distinctions along majoritarian and minority lines. And so yeah, that's one of the that's the starting point. And also at that point there was another project which was being conducted by Professor Sara Ansari at Royal Holloway College, and she was looking at citizenship, the transition from colonial subjecthood to citizenship, broadly speaking, in South Asia. And I attended one of the workshops, and I found the conversations very interesting, and I thought, okay, one needs to look at similar processes and theoretical debates, as they are applicable in case of Pakistan. And I would say that, there is this general scholarship on Pakistan tends to be, in a way, it's very reductive. Like, it does not take into account the complexities of Pakistan's history. There's a very predictable kind of a template, so to speak, right? It starts off by saying that Pakistan was created, the objective resolution was passed, it became an Islamic country, followed by waves of military rule, lack of democratization, rise in extremist violence, jihadis, and this and that. And that's pretty much end of the story. Whereas I wanted to, and I've tried to locate Pakistan within the broader context of, decolonization. And think about Pakistan and the idea of Pakistan, as you referred to the other edited volume, as something which was being widely debated, and people had very kind of like ideas about what it means to set up an Islamic state. So there is there is a kind of an intellectual history of the idea of Pakistan or the Muslim Qaum and its various critiques, which needs to be seriously taken into account. So that has been an inspiration, and I try to sort of then provide that kind of an intellectual history of Pakistan and the idea of Pakistan.
No, congratulations on the book. It's a very rich treatment of both the theoretical discourse and the empirical archival research that you've conducted.
Thank you.
Before we delve into the book, I want to kind of figure out where it's situated in the wider scheme of your scholarship. Your previous work has addressed the question of how Pakistani history has a master narrative, and I want to build on that by talking about, your earlier comment about the complexities of the idea of Pakistan and how that was a contested idea being largely ignored in the popular historical discourse. So what do you think are the deficiencies in Pakistan's historical discourse, and how does this idea of a master narrative defining how Pakistan's history is understood and how Pakistanis understand their history?
I think that's a very important question, and I would say that there is this textbookish, the Pakistan studies version of Pakistan's history, which makes a mockery of history as a discipline. And I say this quite often to my students and to my colleagues as well, that there is a serious history of the idea of Muslim Qaum or Muslim nationhood, which can be written and which has been written. But the way the way it is portrayed in Pakistani textbooks, and also in a lot of state-sponsored kind of like academic works as well, it's a caricature of that history, right? So one can look at. So what I've tried to do in that article which you're referring to, I try to historicize that historical treatment itself as to what are the bases of imagining the Muslim Qaum and then writing a history of that Muslim Qaum as a process which unfolded from 19th century onwards, but takes a different shape in the post-colonial context, where the state is eager to anchor its identity within an ideological historical framework. And that ideological historical framework, which was constructed by leading historians, by historians who were really qualified. Someone like Professor Ishtiaq Hussain Qureshi, who was a graduate from St. Stephen's and was did his PhD from Oxford or Cambridge. He knew Persian really well, has done some fantastic work on Mughal and Delhi Sultanates, and yet he was committed to using history for state-making purposes, and giving it an ideological lens, right? So I look at that process and the history of that process, and the intellectual poverty of that project, with its very predetermined kind of an outcome, which is and a linear trajectory of events, which then lead to the creation of Pakistan. So my submission has been that there is, like I said, a much more rich account to be provided about how is it that the idea of Muslim Qaum emerged as and how it was contingent on certain impacts, especially that of colonial modernity, which led to that process, and that there is a great deal of debate about it. Some other scholars also have looked into it. So for instance, Dhulipala's work about Pakistan as New Medina, where he gives a rather descriptive account of how readers, politicians, religious scholars were all debating actively, like what it means to be what the Pakistan project means. What was their imagination about that project? And in that context, when I was co-editing with Megan Robb this volume on Muslim League and the critics of Pakistan. So this was our endeavor. All these critics of the Muslim League or Jinnah or the idea of Pakistan were not necessarily against the idea of Muslim Qaum as such. It's just that they had a different kind of understanding of the Muslim Qaum itself, right? And they are based on that understanding of Muslim Qaum. They had a different kind of an outcome. Like for them, they preferred a different kind of a solution. So what I'm trying to say is that both Madani and Abul Kalam Azad and others, they also believed in some idea of a Muslim Qaum, but that was an idea which was rooted in Indian civilizational traditions, to which they thought Muslims have contributed so much that they can speak from a position of strength and from a position of numerical strength, and that their future will be secure, in fact, in a better way in united India. Right, so it does not undermine as such the idea of the Muslim Qaum itself. Provides more nuance, provides more complexity, and hence I think makes a much better history, I would say. So my own contribution in that volume was a chapter which I wrote on Maulana Maududi, and again, so Maulana Maududi's idea was very different. So because for him, there is no such thing as a Muslim Qaum in a Western sense, and it's something which is echoed in Iqbal's writings as well, because for him, technically, theoretically, Islam is a universality. Islam is a universal community of believers, and anyone, regardless of their origins, language, race, blood, ethnicity, can become part of that global community of believers.
So was that particularity associated with the nation state considered anathema and completely contradictory to the universal approach that Islam ordained?
Yes, for Maududi it was very clear. From Maududi it was very clear that if it is going to be like that particularity, as you rightly pointed out, was an anathema for Maududi. Like, and that's one. Then secondly, that he said he questioned the credentials of those who were claiming to set up an Islamic State. He said, look at the people who are leading that movement, right? So if they are unable to implement Islam on their own bodies, how can they possibly implement Islam in such a big country which they're claiming to create in the name of Islam? So I think this is. I can understand that, for textbook purposes at primary, secondary level, whatever, it's there's a limit to what you can teach to young kids, but at least at college level, I think it should be more open. There should be more open discussion about Pakistan, its history, and various people who contested these ideas and were there within their own right. They were making very legit kind of critiques, I would say.
No, absolutely. Speaking of linear trajectories, I grew up thinking Pakistan was created on the anniversary of Muhammad bin Qasim landing in what is now the subcontinent. And there's various iterations of mythologies like that are perpetuated through the primary and secondary curriculum. It's interesting because, and let's dive into the book now. You talk a little bit about the need for a homogenizing national narrative that the state, that the state-making project delves in wholeheartedly. In what ways do you think that national narrative was conceived in the early years after Pakistan's formation?
Okay, so at the outset, it needs to be said that post-colonial state development is a process which is it's similar in many ways, because all post-colonial states, whether it's Pakistan, India, and others, they were, there's this idea that we have a lot of catching up to do. So they were looking for centralized structures. They wanted to emphasize on economic growth. At the same time, they wanted to transform into republics. They wanted to set up institutions. They wanted to introduce democracy. All of it is these were like shared kind of concerns. What is I think different in case of Pakistan is the focus on addressing as to what is going to be the ideological kind of like future of the Pakistani state, right? So while we know, we know about the objectives resolution which was passed in March 1949, but there was a similar objectives resolution that was passed by the Congress party even prior to independence, right? So it's the idea was to set direction. So the kind of direction which the Pakistani state set for itself included, among other things, such as women rights, adult franchise, provision of justice and this and that, and also setting up a state which enables Muslims to live their lives according to Quran and Sunnah, right? So that's the distinctive part about Pakistani state making project, which I argue in this book that was again a very contested kind of an idea, because there was no easy right for those who were trying to argue for or establish an Islamic state, because there was considerable opposition from not just Hindu but also Muslim members of the Constituent Assembly from East Bengal. Almost all of them came from East Bengal, and none of them, or hardly anyone, from West Pakistan.
No, that's very interesting, primarily because I think I find it really interesting that you talk about how there was a newness associated with the idea of Pakistan, right? India was widely known, but the name Pakistan had been coined, about a decade and a half before the sovereign entity that is Pakistan came into being. And so there was a need perhaps to emphasize continuity and emphasize that the state was part of a lineage of antiquated, of a historical tradition, basically. And from that, I want to, segue into talking about how the the elite in the nascent state navigated what you refer to in your book as Islamic modernism. How did that come to dominate discussions about what it meant to be Pakistani, or what the idea was of Pakistan was supposed to be?
So I have argued in this book and generally as well that the leaders of Pakistan movement, they were mostly Islamic modernists, right? So they, in their ideology, in their understanding of Islam, Islam was a very egalitarian force. They thought that Islam was compatible with modernity, Islam was compatible with ideas of justice, freedom, democracy, and that, and there are speeches attributed which Jinnah made where he said that there's nothing which is for which we have to take inspiration from elsewhere, right? So we have our own sort of code of life, and for these ideas, we can take inspiration from Islam. So in that sense, it is they were keen on. Jinnah was, I think, very, very clear about setting up a state where the predominant driving force was going to be Islamic modernism, and an Islamic modernist understanding of ideas of justice, of freedom, of equal rights, and this and that. And this is something which was shared by Liaqat Ali Khan as well. So while one can argue and one must take into account the fact that it served the purposes of the newly established Pakistani state to instrumentalize Islam for the purposes of state making. It provided them with this, they thought it will provide that essential glue to keep these distinct ethnic nationalities, in fact, to keep these distinct nationalities, national groups together, right? And also to use that as a force to override any other form of political aspiration or need for national recognition or calls for democratic rights or redistribution of economic resources. So that was, and so both these things must be taken into account. This genuine kind of aspiration or a belief that we can and we will set up a role model of an Islamic state for the rest to follow, as Liaqat Ali Khan famously said in his speech when the objectives resolution was being debated, that the world has seen the excesses of both communism and capitalism, and Islam provides a certain kind of a middle path, and this is what we are going to do. But at the same time, also take into account this criticism which was coming from the leaders of East Bengal, even Muslim leaders of East Bengal, people like Suhrawardi, who said that this is basically a ploy to dilute Bengali majority, and this is an attempt at controlling the Pakistani democratic structure in a manner where, under the garb of setting up an Islamic state, you are denying rights to other people.
So it was a way to dominate effectively the state-making project in a way that would be counter-majoritarian, particularly for East Pakistan, or later as it succeeded to become Bangladesh.
So I mean, like you said, so yeah, it's very, very important. At the same time, I referred to that discussion where the passage of objective resolution followed by setting up of a board of Islamic scholars to help the parliament, the Constituent Assembly, draft a constitution for Pakistan, led by leading scholars of the time, and they were being paid a very generous amount. 1,000 rupees a month back then was, I think, was a good amount, which shows you the kind of the interest or eagerness, perhaps, that the state had. So. Yeah.
At the same time in the book, at a number of points, you claim that calling Pakistan an Islamic republic was both performative and symbolic to a large extent also. Contrast that with the genuine desire to formulate a state based on the principles of Islamic modernism. How do those two things interface and exist simultaneously?
I think it's I would bring in this some other problem which was being faced, I think, by the Pakistani state, where it became increasingly difficult to manage the discourse on Islam. So right, so all of this could have functioned if it could have continued if the Pakistani state could have had been able to dominate the discourse on Islam. And so increasingly, one could say that even one example is the anti-Ahmadiyya movement in 1953. So while the Muslim League and its leadership, they refused to accept the demands which were being put forward by the leaders of that movement, and the Muslim League was very clear that Ahmadis will not be declared non-Muslims, and Sir Zafrullah Khan would not be dismissed, and that Ahmadi rights will be protected, and while affirming their belief in the idea of the finality of prophethood and this and that. So I mean, these cracks, these fissures, they become clear very early on, and so and we see that and this trend, which is and this optimism that we can control this narrative, in fact, was at its highest point during Ayub Khan's period, and which might sound very, in a way, unbelievable, because otherwise, Ayub Khan is considered to be some kind of like a Kemalist in his vision of the state. But it was Ayub Khan, in my opinion, who thought that he could control that narrative. Again, Ayub Khan was also that kind of a person who thought that Islam is a progressive force. It's just that we have to rescue that force from the clutches of the mullah. And as long as we can control the mullah, we are going to use this force for emancipatory, progressive, liberal causes and purposes, and that is why for Ayub Khan, his biggest enemy perhaps was Jamaat-e-Islami and Maududi, because he and I've quoted some examples in the book as well, that he was that his government took a lot of inspiration from Jamaat-e-Islami and the way they were able to. So there's a discussion in the cabinet, in the governors' conference, that look how they are able to convince and to impress the Pakistani intelligentsia or the middle classes, and we need to follow their model. We need to set up parallel institutions so that we can reach out to that class, which is very influential as well. Right?
Perfect. I want to also perhaps probe the central contradiction or binary of citizenship and nationality that serves as the organizing kind of binary in your in the theoretical framework that you use to delve into a lot of this history. So what is the difference between citizenship and nationality, and why is it particularly relevant in Pakistan's case?
I think it is something which is relevant globally now, so the way I am approaching it, I'm using Hannah Arendt's, that's very famous quote from Hannah Arendt's book. So as you know, Hannah Arendt is this famous German Jewish philosopher who suffered during the Nazi regime, had to leave Germany, and she was exiled to and she ended up in the USA. And so she famously said, the right to have rights, right? So it's not in its abstraction, in its theoretical abstraction of equality, of universal principles. We are all human beings, and it is our subjectivity as human beings that we are endowed with certain inalienable rights. But the horrors of the interwar period and the Second World War and what has happened since then, the specters of statelessness, shows that it is through a membership of a certain community of blood and affinity that one is able to get recognition as a human being, and make claims to having certain rights, right? Even belonging, even membership of a state itself is not enough in that sense. So again, going back to Hannah, so Hannah Arendt was a German citizen, but she did not belong to the German nation, right? So that's the distinction, and hence this idea of an affective kind of a bond with a community, and hence this urge to to be associated with that majoritarian ethos, which is governing, or which is the predominant mode of being in a nation state. So this is where how I use this argument to make a distinction that, while in its universalist pretense of equality, citizenship provides that ideal, but in its practice, it is through a majoritarian affective bond of belonging to a community or a nation that one actually gets to exercise rights. So this is a distinction between citizen and a national, which is very pronounced in case of Pakistan, but it has always been a case everywhere, right? So we see these in case of Pakistan, perhaps it's more visible because it is very crudely spelled out in the constitution, between a believer and a non-believer, between a Muslim and a non-Muslim, or even a Sunni or a Shia or a Deobandi or a other groups. So, but it is everywhere. I mean, we are seeing iterations of it in India next doors, right? So it's the idea that it's India belongs to Hindus, and that India should be a Hindu Rashtra, and that and hence the famous phrase article by Gyan Pandey, can a Muslim be an Indian, right? So and similar, we see these similar kind of concerns, anxieties being becoming relevant in again in Germany, the rise of the far right, in Holland, in Italy, in the USA, right? So it's something which is at the heart of any nation state project, that it creates these kinds of majorities and minorities. That's the operating sort of principles of nation states.
That distinction between national and citizen, I find fascinating in how you explore refugees and migrants from what then became India and the newly formed state of Pakistan. So to flip the question that you were asking, in the early years of the state, could a non-Muslim be considered Pakistani? What were some of the interesting empirical things that the archives, that you discovered in the archives, and what were some of the contradictions and perhaps absurdities that gave birth to?
I think that's a very important question because on paper, the Pakistani citizenship law, drafted in 1951, amended in 52, and then there have been several other amendments as well later on. It's a very liberal piece of legislation in the sense that it allows for naturalization process, and in a way citizenship by birth, with some kind of like qualifiers. And it does not mention religion as a requirement at all. There is neither in the legislation itself nor in its rules, right? So because rules are important as to how the law itself is implemented. It is only, but it's only in the bureaucratic archive that I consulted at the National Archives. It's within that archive that we get to know as to how the citizenship law was actually being implemented. And the 50s is a very important decade because this is when this large influx of refugees and transfer of population was taking place on both sides. And there was still this kind of like an openness or possibility whereby people who had left, who had been forced to leave, like I'm talking about Hindus and Sikhs especially, who left from West Punjab and left their a massive amount of property in West Punjab, and they were forced to migrate and leave. They would have, and some of them did actually try to come back, claim their properties, sell it off perhaps, and then leave, right? So perhaps after the violent experience of partition, and the fact that they thought Pakistan is going to become an Islamic state, and that in an Islamic state their rights would not be protected, they would not have liked to live. I'm just conjecturing. But still, they would have liked to come back, claim their properties, dispose it off and then go back. But this right to return was an impossibility. But this right to return had to be written into the law in a manner that did not make it impossible for the intending Muslim migrant from North India to arrive in Pakistan. You know what I mean? So while on the one hand, the law had to be drafted in a manner that Hindus and Sikhs could not return, but at the same time keep the door open for intending Muslim migrant to come to Pakistan. And so that was done by saying that those who used to live in what is now present day Pakistan, and who have after March, I think the cut of March 1947 have left, and that they have now become citizens of some other state, are not allowed to return. Right? So all these people, millions of them, had obviously left after March 47, mostly after August 47, and technically they had become Indian citizens. So they could not now, so since they had become citizen of another state, they automatically were now disqualified from becoming ever again Pakistani citizen, even though they were uprooted or they were forced to leave without their will. They did not leave out of like their it was not a voluntary kind of like a migration. Whereas on the other hand, a Muslim living in India could still, come to Pakistan and apply for a certificate, a citizenship certificate, and after a while, they were allowed to become Pakistani citizen. So that's how it's very, very clear in the archive, because because this is a very active archive in the sense that it was being used to regulate the citizenship law in the country back then. And there is one officer in particular that I referred to, Hamiduddin Ahmed, who wrote it very, very clearly that Pakistan is a Muslim national state, and that we cannot allow Hindus and Sikhs to return because and as I mentioned in the book, there were perhaps pragmatic reasons for that as well. It's not just ideological. Pragmatic being that there were already millions of Muslim refugees who were occupying the properties of those Hindus and Sikhs that had left. So if a large number of Hindus and Sikhs were allowed to return, then obviously it would have created a serious crisis for the state, right? So this is how it's something which is where it becomes really important for us to uncover these kind of documentation, these kind of archives, and then read these archives critically to understand them as providing a very different kind of a perspective on Pakistani history.
I think where I want to go from here is perhaps pose to you the question of what impact the political instability that kind of punctuated and defined Pakistan's early years had on the structure and form of these debates over the extent to which Pakistan was supposed to be a Muslim state or a state primarily populated by Muslim nationals. Did that play a big impact, or did that have a big impact, or was there some degree of continuity in achieving this desire?
I think like I said, it was a very contentious kind of a process. It was not an easy ride. So while one could say that East Bengali Muslims and Hindus were very vocal in the Constituent Assembly debates, and they came up with counter critiques and their own ideas about what it means to set up an Islamic state, which they said that if you really want to, and if you are interested in setting up an Islamic state, then you should be abolishing Jagirdaris, you should be nationalizing industry, you should be providing for justice and safeguard the rights of women and laborers. That's what an Islamic state means. So that's one way. And also in West Pakistan, where one could say that perhaps in the assembly, in the Constituent Assembly, progressive voices were not predominant, or they did not have representation, but there was a very, very active group of Marxist academics and activists and labor unions which were pushing for an alternative kind of conceptualization as to how, and the role which was played by, for instance, newspapers like Imroz Pakistan Times was very central to providing this alternative kind of like a critique as to how the Pakistani state should be shaped.
And what's fascinating is that these debates and this contestation spilled over not just into public and popular discourse, as you mentioned, but also in official discourse on the symbols that of the nation. So one of the more fascinating histories that you elaborate on in the volume is that of the national anthem. So tell us, Dr. Qasmi, set the record straight. What's the real history of the Pakistan national anthem? Who wrote it? We know that, of course, but what were some of the debates and the disagreements behind how the national anthem was agreed upon and the extent to which it was made a subject of critique?
So the controversy which you're referring to, it's a more recent one, perhaps it's not older than 10-15 years, where the claim is that Jagannath Azad, who was a good Urdu poet, lived in Kashmir, that he was the person that Jinnah hired to write Pakistan's national anthem. Now, there is no official record. There is absolutely no archival record for that. There's not even any circumstantial evidence for that. The only claim that we have is perhaps an interview that Azad gave towards the end of his life. But other than that, other than his personal testimony, so it is possible that perhaps he wrote what we call a Milli Naghma, or a national song, but not a national anthem. And for that too, it's highly unlikely that Jinnah would know someone as, he was not that significant as a poet, perhaps. That why would Jinnah know Jagannath Azad? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right? So there is no evidence for, and I'm relying on. I mean, I've looked at cabinet records as well, but there is also some excellent work done by Dr. Aqil Abbas Jafri. He's written a book on Qaumi Tarana, on Pakistan's national anthem. So the record suggests that it was from the very beginning. There was that Hafiz Jalandhari was chosen for this task, and perhaps I think rightly so, because Hafiz was known as one of the greatest poets of a lyrical poet, right? Someone who was really a master of writing naghmas and songs, and he had written an entire history of Islam in verse called Shahnameh-e-Islam. So someone who would write such a voluminous work of creative poetic history, you can gauge the poetic excellence of someone like him. So he initially, according to his own account, he wrote, and you can perhaps play that in his own voice, the original anthem that he wrote.
ऐ मेरे आबाद वतन आज़ाद पाकिस्तान जिंदाबाद पाकिस्तान, तेरे मंदिर तेरे दरिया को सारो मैदान, सल्तनतों सामान खुदाए पाक कहे एहसान, तू है पाक अमानत जिस पर जिंदगियां कुर्बान, जिस पर जिंदगियां कुर्बान, तुझ पे निछावर माल जान औलाद पाकिस्तान जिंदाबाद पाकिस्तान, चांद सितारा तेरा परचम रहमत बार निशान, इस परचम का साया हम पर लाया अमन अमान, खल्क खुदा का फर्द फर्द है शाद पाकिस्तान जिंदाबाद पाकिस्तान, अदल मुसावात और उखुव्वत कुव्वत है ईमान, अदल मुसावात और उखुव्वत कुव्वत है ईमान, मशरिक़ मग़रिब दीदा दिल हैं दोनों हैं ज़ीशान, मशरिक़ मग़रिब दोनों दिल हैं दोनों हैं ज़ीशान, आम रवादारी पर कायम जमहूरी ईमान, आम रवादारी पर कायम जमहूरी ऐवान, कलमा तैयब उस्तवार बुनियाद पाकिस्तान जिंदाबाद पाकिस्तान जिंदाबाद पाकिस्तान,
which he claims was almost approved by the then Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan. But then for some reasons, he says, it was the process was derailed. because as you can imagine, there were other people as well who were interested, who thought that this is going to be a huge honor to write Pakistan's national anthem. So someone like Zulfiqar Bukhari, for instance, who was the director of Pakistan Radio and was considered very influential. So anyway, so a committee was set up, and I think SM Ikram was heading that committee, and they invited entries from all over the country. And this is where I think I'm very surprised that the record does not include those hundreds of entries which were submitted by hundreds of Pakistan's poets. It would have made a very interesting archive, actually, looking at those 500, 600 anthems which were submitted. Anyways, and because all these anthems were trying to fit into the tune which had already been decided. So the tune had been decided earlier, the tune which was composed by Chagla, and the reason was, which is given, is that the Iranian emperor was visiting or was going to visit on an official trip, and so the country did not have an anthem, but they said, like, let's first get with the tune, so they could play the tune and they could wait for the anthem later. But it took them 7 years to get lyrics for the anthem, because it's a very difficult tune, right? So I'm not an expert on music, and I generally rely on my friend Ali Raj, who's doing his PhD from Columbia, has done some fantastic work on that, as to the nuances of that tune and how Jalandhari had to work with that tune to write those lyrics. And so when the anthem was finally composed, approved, and once it was released, it was immediately there was a controversy, in the sense that the Bengalis were not happy, because in fact they were not the only ones, but like no one understood a word of it. It still is, it's almost as if you have to translate it even today, because it is in very heavily Persianized Urdu. There's only one word of Urdu which has been used in that anthem, and it is ka, right? So everything else is, I mean, you can say that most of these words are everyday, are kind of like used every day in everyday conversation as well, but there are some which are kind of archaic. So there was a backlash, and people were unhappy. They thought, but what is interesting is that something which we think of as sacred or very important, but it required the state to train the people as to how to sing that anthem, right? So it's been 70
it was a major pedagogical exercise,
exactly,
as you mentioned in the book. Yeah.
Exactly. So people were hired who would go out and train students and teachers how to sing the anthem, right? So now it's been like 70 odd years, so we think it's something very, very natural. It does not come to you very naturally.
Yeah.
It's a difficult anthem to memorize and sing.
It reads like a piece of literature. Was there a particular reason for why it was intended to be like that, or it's just that's the way it came to be?
I think Jalandhari was, or other poets who were being consulted, they were just stuck with the tune. If it had been open-ended, like if there was no sort of limitation that they all had to conform to that tune, then possibly it could have been possible to come up with a more easygoing kind of like, and that's why I argue that the original anthem was much more. It flowed really well. It was more catchy, and I have been suggesting people that why don't you make a Milli Naghma out of it and saying it's going to be a huge hit. It's a ready-made thing out there. But also I think it's that the state wanted a more sober kind of like. A more sober, in a way, tribute to the state, right? So, and because this is where the Schmittian kind of like idea of political theology is relevant as well, where it's kind of like of a liturgical kind of like a chant in praise of the state, like something which we recite in praise of God. So
that is outside of normal lexicon
Yes.
and the vocabulary that we would use day to day. It has to be more festive. It has to be more proper, perhaps, than day-to-day quotidian interaction.
Yeah. So it sort of creates this kind of like an aura about the grandeur
Of the state.
basically. Yeah.
And so similar, historical disagreements have been at the heart of an issue that still, I think, many of us can relate to today, which is moon sighting. So using the sightings of the moon to determine when Eid or other national holidays will be. First, I want you to talk a little bit about the significance of calendarizing particular dates, particular anniversaries, holidays, what significance that had for the state-making project, and perhaps how that fits into your understanding of the national versus the citizen.
Okay, I think which is it's a very good question, because it reminds me of some other parts of the book and an article that I wrote about this whole making of a national calendar, right? So, and I was going through a catalog at the National Documentation Center, where I found there was one file on the list of holidays, and I thought, like, why was cabinet looking at, like, what business is the cabinet to look at which holidays to celebrate and whether and then I saw that there were these list of holidays were being discussed almost every year, and then how gradually the nature of the kind of events which were sanctioned or approved or which were being celebrated as a closed holiday or a bank holiday or a national holiday, there are three different kind of terminologies which are used. It shifted, like from celebrating King George's birthday to celebrating Jinnah's birthday or Iqbal's birthday, which is another controversy, and to celebrating Dussehra in the 50s to celebrating only Muslim festivals, right? So in the 50s, there were a lot of Buddhist, Jain and Hindu festivals which were also part of the national calendar, which were later on under Ayub Khan, they were made part of this list of optional holidays, where only members of that community could avail those holidays, right? So it increasingly, because again, but there the idea was that we need more efficiency. We need to reduce the number of holidays. We need people to work more, and hence to reduce holidays, they cut down all non-Islamic holidays and replace them all with events or personalities or festivals associated with Islam. So so the with regard to Eid or moon sighting, now so there was it was mainly a concern that we need to come up with a unifying kind of an event or a festival. So there is the idea was that we need to convert Eid into a national festival. That's the word that was being used, is the term that was being used. And in this conversion process, where Eid was more of a different kind of a religious cultural festival, how it was transformed, how its meaning was transformed, because the state wanted to appropriate it for nation building and unifying purposes. Right. So that's the transformation which I am trying to look at.
And I find it interesting that the deletion and selective remembrance of particular commemorative acts, whether it's holidays and other features on the calendar, how they serve into your earlier scholarship on the master narrative, that there was a master narrative that all of this had to fit into, one that was aligned particularly with the goals of state making. I want to continue talking about the symbology of the state. Because there's a lot of other interesting, facets of the state symbology. So whether it's the state emblem or the color, the exact shade of green that goes into the flag, why is it, you think, that there was such, debate about these things when these things could have been, simple bureaucratic decisions?
So I think this is where, the idea that it's the state which is going to, in a way, protect the nation. Right. So while in the pre-47 period, whatever you want to call the national movement or freedom movement, or so there was no, it did not come up as a question that we need to have a consistency in the shade of green that the flag that we are waving should have, exact measurements of how the moon or the crescent should align with the star or whatever. Right?
There's a part of the book that I can't forget where it's whether it's the waning moon or the waxing moon, and how that generated a lot of debate. I think everyone should read that.
It is still it's still an ongoing debate. Actually, it's not ended.
It's not settled.
It's not settled. It's something which people. I was talking to the director of archives, and he said that a lot of people they still write to the cabinet secretary, to the prime minister's office, requesting that you must change the shape of
the crescent on the flag.
Crescent. Yeah, because it is the reason. And as long as we have this declining crescent, moon, whatever, I don't know. So
on the flag, we will continue to be a nation in decline, basically, until we change the flag.
So I mean, there is another example actually, which is I think, which is that of not just declaring Iqbal as a national poet, because there was some disagreement, because the Bengalis insisted that why Iqbal, why not Nazrul Islam, and so there was this demand that Nazrul should also be considered at par with Iqbal,
yeah.
And secondly, then once Iqbal was and so that is why there was no national holiday for Iqbal as such in Pakistan. There was one in West Pakistan, but not in United Pakistan. It's only after 1971 that
Iqbal Day became a national holiday, so to speak. Yeah.
Yes. So and that too came about in an interesting manner, because it's we now celebrate Iqbal Day. I don't know if the holiday still is continued or it's been discontinued. It was discontinued, I remember, 10 years ago, but I don't know if it's been revived since then. Anyways, so now that we celebrate Iqbal Day on 9th November, but that was not always the case. And just the fact, like, why does it matter when was Iqbal born? Iqbal never took that question seriously. For him, it was irrelevant, and in his lifetime, no one really bothered about it. But for what happened was that in 1972, 73, I have to check, but yeah. So Indian government announced that they were going to celebrate or commemorate the centenary of Iqbal's birthday, because according to their records, and records which were also recognized by the Pakistani state, Iqbal was born in February 1873 or 2, and hence it was going to be centenary year. And so in a way, Pakistanis were taken aback, because it was Pakistan which claimed that Iqbal is our national poet, and it was embarrassing that you don't even know when he was born, and
the exact dates that your national
and
poet
that
was
it's going
born.
to be centenary. So then a committee was set up. Imagine a committee of leading Iqbal scholars, including Dr. Javed Iqbal, to probe
and deduce his birthday.
And yes, and they went through like a lot of record. They went to Sialkot, and they looked at the registers of birth and death, which were in the DC office. And based on that, they were looking at like Iqbal's father's name was Sheikh Nathu, and they identified like there so many different Sheikh Nathus, and they lived in different mohallas. Kashmiri, but he lived in Kashmiri mohalla because he was a Kashmiri, and he was a tailor. So they were looking at how many children were born to him during that period between 1872 to 1877, and then based on that calculation, there still is no entry for
Muhammad Iqbal's
Muhammad
birthday.
Iqbal being registered in the local municipality records. There's no entry for 9th November 1877. However, Iqbal used an Islamic Hijri date, exact Islamic Hijri date, on his form which he filled out for his PhD. So the fact that he used an exact Hijri date, which converts to 9th November 1877, was then taken as his exact date of birth.
The evidence,
yeah, because and it makes sense, because in a time period where people were no longer they were only using Georgian calendar, why would he use a very specific exact Hijri date? So it's a political act as well. where he's in Germany, he wants to assert his Muslim identity he wants to sort of challenge the Western model, temporal or spatial, whatever model,
Yeah.
and hence, so that's how we got to have 9th November
as a national holiday.
Yeah.
I want to take this opportunity to switch gears to talk about perhaps something towards in the later half of your book, which is about how the ulama got along with state authorities. Now, there's fascinating details here in this volume. You talk about how when the Second Amendment was about to be passed, or when it was being debated in the parliament, multiple religious scholars were invited to offer their testimonies about whether the Ahmadiyya community was outside the fold of Islam and whether they could be declared as non-Muslims and so on. So give us a brief description and a little bit of a synopsis of your argument about how the ulama have gotten along with state authority and what that relationship and the tensions in it have looked like.
I think it's like I said, there was this attempt by the Pakistani state to dominate the discourse on Islam, and it is this in a way the publicness of Islamic language and the way in which it gradually changed the kind of like secular language of the law, which enabled ulama to further establish their credentials and claim that, look, if it is going to be an Islamic state, if you are trying to draft Islamic laws, then you need authoritative sort of scholars who know the language, who are trained in that tradition, who can provide guidance on these issues. And I think it's very logical that they would get support from or recognition for these credentials from the larger public as well, that they would also recognize ulama as embodiment of this kind of like authoritative knowledge about Islam. And then there is I think there is this eagerness as well on the part of the ulama to embrace state authority, because like others, I think they also recognize, and Maududi is a very clear theorist of this kind of an approach, that state is a very powerful tool that they can use to refashion the society, right? And especially from an Islamist perspective, especially from someone like Maududi, that so much of corruption has happened in the Islamic intellectual tradition. He would not just include the colonial interruption, but like for him, it goes all the way back to the end of the pious caliphate period, right? So since from there onwards, for him, this entire period of intellectual moral corruption has created a crisis, and that can only be undone by acquiring state power, right? So that's a more Islamist kind of like an approach. But for general ulama, this idea of being co-opted by the state or becoming partners with state power was something that they did not really have a problem with. And that is, I think, and one example which I give in this book, again coming back to the moon sighting committee and the practices, and where I argue that initially when the ulama were consulted about this issue, they all almost unanimously they said that there is no need for celebrating the Eid on the same day, because there is no such compulsion. There is no Islamic provision as such which requires us to do that. And it's and hence it's let's leave it open. And others had other reasons, like one of them said that, like, because what you're proposing is using scientific mathematical calculations, and which is something which is not the kind of like orthodox practice. Only heterodox groups have been using these practices. But once the government announced to set up a committee, they were very eager to then join the committee, and since then they have been part of in fact, they are the only ones who are part of the committee
today. Yeah,
right. So they, in a way, they went against their own tradition. So starting from a point where they said that no such committee is required, or that no such unanimity is required, to a point where they now insist that we are the ones who are going to authorize as to when the moon, Eid moon, has been sighted.
That's fascinating indeed. I also want to talk a little bit, and you comment on this explicitly in the book, about the state of Pakistan's archives. And as a former student of history myself, as someone who's very passionate about Pakistani history, I find it somewhat heartbreaking, perhaps, the comments that in your book. Could you elaborate a little about the state of Pakistan's archives, the state of Pakistan's historical records, and what that means for history writing and for our understanding of history?
I would say that what it means for history writing is that there's a huge opportunity, as well as, it's very, very frustrating as well. It's opportunity because then it's out there and no one is able to explore those archives. So, and I always tell my students and fellow colleagues that there's one informal conversation that we had with Professor Aisha Jalal, where Professor Jalal said that, basically, if you want to be a historian in Pakistan, you have to create your own archive, right? So, which is that if you are patient enough, and if you work with public records offices, libraries, and archives, there's a chance that you will end up discovering a treasure trove, which in my case has happened like twice. My book on Ahmadis was basically by chance. I ended up finding the entire record of the Munir Inquiry Commission, which was just like
the one set up in after the riots in 52 and 53.
Yes. So imagine the day-to-day proceedings of those
of the entire commission.
The way they were getting written responses. They were there was an entire probing of all the people who were involved in all of it. So all that record, multiple copies of that record, were just lying in a corner in the civil secretariat library. And I asked the librarian where this record came from. He said the chief commissioner, what's it called? Chief secretary, sorry. The chief secretary, Punjab, he wanted to get rid of his library. He was renovating his offices, whatever. So these were lying in his office, and he just dumped them, right? And so with this book, I also traveled extensively to multiple visits to Karachi, to Islamabad, and
to Dhaka, you mentioned,
and Dhaka as well. So I think it's in a way, the problem is that the archivists themselves, I don't blame them at all, actually, because they do not have resources, they do not have manpower, the kind of equipment which is required to keep these documents safe and to catalog them properly. It's just not there. It's only possible, and that is why only National Documentation Center is a place where because they have enough resources, they have the required, because the cabinet division provides for those resources. There, it is very easy to access. But then there are some very unnecessary kind of regulations which make it difficult for historians to get access to complete files, which is very, these are restrictions, regulations which are completely unnecessary. These are documents which are 50 years old. If you cannot share the minutes and the internal correspondence, there's nothing to be seen in that file then. We are not just looking at the decision. We want to understand as to how they arrived at that decision,
rather than just the final outcome itself.
So, but there have been historians in Pakistan have been doing fantastic work, thinking of all different creative kinds of sources and archives in building that kind of source base. So one recent example is that of I think an incredible book by my colleague Ilyas Chatta on Punjab borderlands, where he is looking at smuggling patterns, networks in Punjab post 47, and he extensively looked at local thanas on border villages like Thana Barki, Thana on other areas, and how local FIRs were being registered against wannabe
people, smugglers,
and who became tycoons Ghurkis and Dayals and Seth Abid, and they all started from this. So these are the frustrations of being doing history in Pakistan, but also the the kind of fascinating work that you can do, you know.
So its own set of challenges, but fascinating stuff for anyone to find who dares to. I want to come to the question of, I think you address this in towards the end. Also, you talk about perhaps the opportunity and the possibilities of more egalitarian outcomes if we were to foster a better, perhaps more critical understanding of the historical origins of state making in Pakistan. What is it that ordinary citizens can do better in their relationship with both the historical record, with historiography, with historical writing? And how is it that can perhaps improve civic life in Pakistan, or even political life, dare I say?
I think for that, we need more critical scholarship on Pakistan. If we want our students, our journalists, lawyers, civil society to be more actively engaged, they need to have a good understanding of Pakistan's history, its politics, and that context can be provided by and should be provided by Pakistani academia, which is I must say I think is making improvements, significant improvements over the past decade or so. We have seen young historians, political scientists, anthropologists especially come up and produce some fantastic research. There's still a long way to go, but they are providing that kind of essential critical knowledge, which is then required for a more better understanding. Because it's only once we have that kind of critical knowledge that we can expect a more robust kind of engagement with the wider society, state, and to make a meaningful impact. So the expectation from Pakistani academia is that they should produce that kind of critical knowledge, and also that they should be able to train their students in a manner that inculcates this ability to read texts critically. Right, so this is, for now, perhaps it's limited to these facilities. This kind of training is limited to a few elitist institutions or places, but I think it's spreading. I think YouTube and other medium, the kind of work that you are doing, it makes it possible for a fairly large audience to access these discussions. Right, so my only submission would be that there is a lot of there is an alternative out there as well, kind of like a liberal alternative out there, but which is very simplistic. And I do not see any difference between Pakistan studies and a liberal Pakistan studies.
Yeah, it makes no sense to
Right.
reduce nuance for the sake of advocating for perhaps more egalitarian outcomes.
So Pakistan studies is a state of mind, right? So if it's so I do not necessarily, if it's done for liberal causes or purposes, it does not make it.
It falls into the same traps, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's what I would suggest, that readers should be critically trained to read texts and then decide for themselves, and for academics to produce those texts for them.
Thank you, Dr. Qasmi, for what has been a wonderfully insightful conversation. Qaum, Mulk, Sultanat, Citizenship and National Belonging in Pakistan is out now in local bookstores. Thank you for taking out the time and for adding to the quality of our historical discourse. We look forward to having you again, and we're very, very thankful.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.